Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
When we think about security for huge global events like the Olympics, our thoughts tend to be about the physical. We probably jump right to past terror attacks on the games and how to prevent those things from happening again. Right now, intelligence services from around the globe are coordinating to do just that. They have reportedly foiled at least one planned terror attack on the Paris Games. But they are not the only sort of intelligence operations that are working to protect the Olympics. And physical violence isn't the only way to turn a massive event into utter chaos. Ask any small business or organization that's ever been hit with a cyber attack. They'll tell you two things. First, it can totally derail any hope of functional operation. And second, that it takes just one person and one well-meaning screw-up to bring the whole thing down. A cyber attack on the Paris Olympics could come in almost any form. From taking down one of the IOC's digital systems like ticketing, to grinding Paris's infrastructure to a halt, to stealing identities of some of the world's most famous athletes and celebrities, or even just preying on ordinary fans who are attending events at the games or just watching them online. Just like physical terrorism, there is also a network of intelligence agencies who are coordinating around the online security of these games. They are fighting an uphill battle to prevent that one single mistake that crumbles the entire digital house of cards. And this is how they do that. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Carolyn Xavier is the chief of the Communications Security Establishment of Canada. Hello, Carolyn.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for finding some time for us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you today.
I'm interested in discussing how broad cybersecurity can be during a massive event like the Olympics, which is obviously like a huge logistical challenge. What does quote unquote cybersecurity for an event like this entail?
There's a publication we put out in the month of June because we knew the Olympics were coming, but also because there's major international events that have been going on all around, and we've observed a few things. And as a result of observing a few of these cybersecurity incidents, we thought it was important to put out a publication that warned Canadians and that warned those that are going to be attending events, those that are organizing the events, those that are spectators at these events, because cybersecurity is something as an organization, the Communications Security Establishment, as well as the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, worry about a lot. Because cybersecurity doesn't only happen when we're having major events, it happens every day of our life because we're more and more digital as a community and as a society. But really, in particular, we have noticed that there are some things to be worried about when it comes to major events from a cybersecurity perspective. So, for example, because there's large events going on like the Olympics, we recognize that they become target opportunities, in particular for cybercriminals. They tend to target large organizations because they are going to have primetime news looking at them. They're going to be televised. And so why not use that opportunity to potentially target local businesses, for example, through areas like business email compromises, is what we call them, or through ransomware attacks. And we want to make sure that individuals themselves recognize that they're targets, not just major businesses. And so this publication really does focus on recognizing that, phishing emails or malicious websites could lure you to locations that you would rather not hang out in.
Yeah, what I'd like to understand from a big picture point of view is the different levels to this. So in a little bit, we will talk about personal levels and what people need to be aware of and how to protect themselves, because obviously that's important, to your point, whether you're attending the Olympics or just living your life. But for an organization like the IOC, that has an enormous amount of logistics to coordinate for an event like this. Where are they vulnerable, and what kind of cybercrime are we talking about when we say, it would quote unquote target the Olympics? What does that kind of attack actually look like?
Yeah, no. So listen, my focus as the organization is the chief of the communications security establishment, my focus tends to be in cyber threats. But you're absolutely right that when major events like the IOC puts in place an event like the Olympics, they're worried about all kinds of things, from physical threats, national security threats, to the cyber threats that we're talking about today. And in the cyberspace in particular, we assess that things like hacktivists are people that would want to target these international sporting events, for example. And again, very much linked to cybercrime. We know that some of the things they might try to do is put in place distributed denial of service attacks, or do hack and leak operations. And what I mean by that is that, for example, when an athlete is trying to obtain information as to where they need to go, for example, because of an event they're going to attend, well, some of those locations or websites that are trying to get that information from could end up being compromised by a cyber attack. We know that sometimes state-sponsored cyber threat actors are also likely to engage in what we call cyber espionage, really targeting those prominent and high-profile individuals who are attending major international sporting events, and they end up being cyber espionage possible targets because a state actor might want to potentially have the opportunity to collect personal information so they could potentially see that as a way in at a future date. Maybe not even to do anything in the immediate, but from a cyber threat perspective, perhaps see them as a persistent target later on.
What are hacktivists, by the way? Explain what they are, what they do, what they want.
Yeah, a hacktivist tends to be a cybercriminal, an individual who's maybe sympathetic to the causes from a geopolitical perspective. An individual who may have views about a particular country hosting an event and is concerned about their political stance on something. So often a hacktivist will use the opportunity to perhaps deface a website to send a particular geopolitical message that is of their perspective or their view, or to perhaps ruin the reputation of an event in order to be able to highlight something that they feel strongly about. And we see this sometimes around the war in Ukraine. We see sometimes Russian hacktivists who are potentially facing websites because they're unhappy, for example, that Canada might be hosting a Ukrainian delegation or a Ukrainian delegate within the country and are trying to find ways to embarrass the country, for example. So a hacktivist will act in that manner.
When we talk about something with the eyes of the world on Paris and the huge numbers of people there, what kind of real dangers could a cyber attack pose? And I ask this because I think when people worry about security around the games, their mind instantly goes to things like bombings or even like the train arson attacks that we saw before the game started. But in the cybercrime field, what kinds of actual physical danger could it pose?
So one of the things we work with is critical infrastructure. So that's part of our day job. It's part of our mandate to work with critical infrastructures all across Canada. But in Paris in particular, they would be worried about the same thing, that from a ransomware perspective or from a cyber attack perspective, could any one of those critical infrastructures perhaps be impacted? So, for example, we put out in our past publications about oil and gas and energy sectors being cautious about the fact that they could potentially be high-value targets for cyber criminals or for state nations to potentially put some of those services offline. And when you're putting any of those critical infrastructure services offline through the fact that you can have an exposed, what we call operating technology that is not properly protected with the necessary means and layers that it should have, and the basics aren't done, like patching a particular piece of hardware, when you expose yourself and that critical infrastructure is exposed because that basic cyber hygiene isn't done, then you're potentially rendering vulnerable the whole critical infrastructure or the whole hardware that could render a critical infrastructure disabled. So, services like water, services like the telecos, services like your energy line, your pipelines of that nature are opportunities potentially to have cyber attacks where one can be vulnerable. But this is one of the things that we do from a mandate perspective is ensure that we put out the proper guidelines and we work really hand in glove with our critical infrastructure partners in a way that they're better understanding what the threats are, because we see that, because we have both a mandate from a foreign intelligence perspective, as well as the mandate of cyber defense and cybersecurity, and really ensuring that they're better aware of what some of those threats could be coming their way.
You just mentioned cooperation. Does that extend to intelligence communities between countries or organizations like yourself? Like, what does that sharing of intelligence look like ahead of and during an event like this?
Even outside of an event like the Olympics, we have enduring partnerships. And for example, for us at the Communications Security Establishment, we've been around for over 75 years. And I can tell you in the Five Eyes space in particular, so our allies of the US, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, we've had relationships with them that have endured over 75 years.
Right.
And so especially in the foreign intelligence space. So we build on those partnerships. We ensure that we're doing our part to be a great partner, but we really rely on each other, especially when events of this nature are going on, do our best to protect the event, especially because we're each going to have athletes there. Even though France is not a Five Eye ally, I can assure you that France is an ally. And as you would have seen in some of the television coverage, there's a great deal of Canadian organizations that are represented there from a law enforcement perspective, because partnerships matter even when events aren't happening, but there's a lot to be learned when these major events are happening, and to bring ourselves together and to really work collectively and share intelligence as required, share intelligence because we all want to be able to warn and protect from bad things happening. And so collectively, this is kind of what we do on our day-to-day job, but it's really amplified on the world stage now when you see some of our Canadian law enforcement colleagues that are in place in Paris, walking the streets, working the beat with other law enforcement organizations such as La Gendarmerie in Paris. But I'd say that from a partnership perspective, the partnership doesn't end only within the intelligence space. It also works horizontally with other security and intelligence community members, such as the service colleagues that we have, as well as the RCMP. So
I was going to ask you about that, actually, because obviously your acronyms are identical. How closely do you work with CSIS?
We work very closely with CSIS. We're very closely co-located practically. We're neighbors physically, but we work very closely with them. They definitely have a focus that's a bit more domestic. We are focused on the foreign signals intelligence. So foreign intelligence tends to be our mandate. We work very closely with them when it comes to elements that we see in the foreign space that could potentially then be a domestic threat. And so hand in glove, they're very much an important partner, and we work collectively well together.
When we talk about these big threats to organizations like the IOC, or even just leaving the Olympics out of it, threats to governments or institutions that have been held for ransomware, what is the preventative medicine that you give to these organizations? You mentioned hygiene a little while ago. I guess I'm trying to get a sense of exactly how these organizations can lock down their systems ahead of an event like the Olympics, or even just ahead of what they might determine to be a turbulent time.
So one of the things that we really work hard at is trying to ensure that we're raising cyber resilience. And this is something we really promote in the work that we do, working with private sector, with critical infrastructure, working across government. First of all, we don't like to promote paying the ransom. That is not at all our government stance. It's not our advice. It's not our recommendation. And for a lot of good reasons. And that's probably could be a whole different podcast. But all this to say is that our advice is at least doing the basics. And we outline at least the top 10 things that businesses or organizations should do, which is as simple as patching for one, but there's a whole bunch of other layers of security that we recommend that organizations put in place. But in addition to that, we highly recommend that organizations subscribe to our alerts, subscribe to the publications that we're going to put out, work with us when they have a cyber incident so we can better understand what we call indicators of compromise could be. We also have set up a great deal of governance, both internal to government on how we do our job in protecting Government of Canada systems, but we also have some of this governance set up even with partners in the critical infrastructure. So we have some really long-time established partnerships, especially with our telecommunications organizations here in Canada. We've shown in our most recent annual report the amount of work we've done with the energy sector and the oil and gas sector. There are now an established advisory committee that we're part of. We've done the same with our financial institutions and several other of our critical infrastructure groups, because we recognize that managing cybersecurity and raising that cyber resilience has to be a whole of society and a team sport opportunity. We can't do it alone. We need to be able to learn from them as much as they learn from us. But our primary goal ultimately is always giving them our best advice, supporting them with guidance with these publications that, like the example of the one we're talking about, putting out national cyber threat assessments, of which we're going to put out another one this fall. By the end of this calendar year, we'll have another national cyber threat assessment out, always looking 2 years from now, what the emerging threats are. We've just put out our annual report, which has a wealth of information of examples of things we've seen that we're worried about, but also what, as far as we can tell, because ultimately we can't talk about everything because we are a secret organization at the end of the day, trying to do our best to ensure that we're raising that cyber resilience with all the various partners involved.
What are some of the things that you have heard from your partners and other intelligence services, as much as you can convey them to us, about potential cyber threats leading up to and during the games? Like, what was the chatter saying?
Well, I think like our report indicates, we're really concerned about the fact that it'll be random things that'll appear on your phone, appear on your email if you're a business organization that will literally look legitimate to you. And you will think it's coming from the CFO or the CEO or the COO of an organization, because you know that these are times that are important to be able to be responsive to the head of the IOC, for example. And so when somebody is sending you a message, you're automatically assuming it's legitimate. But we're really trying to promote that people still need to be critical thinkers when they're looking at information, especially during these times, because we know there's heightened vigilance required so that you're not being misled. So, for example, we are aware that our UK colleagues reported an incident where an email account of the managing director of the Premier League Football Club was compromised by a spear phishing email. Ultimately, the good news is it was flagged, it was well known, and no transfer was completed in the request for money. But it's just to show you that these things truly are real in the observations that we've seen. So we know that, especially from a fraudulent perspective or a ransomware request, that's where we see the highest volume of threat. But, as per the examples we spoke about, cyber attacks can come in all kinds of forms, including in search engine optimization poisoning is one of the other terms we use, where, for example, bots are used to be able to render a website more popular and goes up on the list of your Google search, for example, and then it ends up being potentially redirecting you to a malicious site.
Right.
So asking, again, Canadians and individuals to always be vigilant on what they're clicking. And I think this is a hard thing to do because, as I think you mentioned earlier, or perhaps I heard it on your podcast that you did with Jesse not too long ago, where there's this factor of inconvenience that people want to do things so quickly, but it's when we do things quickly and we're bothered about being inconvenient that sometimes we get ourselves in trouble.
How much of a challenge is it, and how do you confront it? This is the thing that keeps coming back to me when it comes to cybersecurity, is like, you can have an organization like the IOC with thousands of members, like the Government of Canada, like the Toronto Public Library in a famous example. These can be huge organizations, but really all it takes in terms of ransomware and cybercrime is like one totally human individual to click the wrong link on an email. Like, it seems like an incredibly difficult challenge to surmount when we look at just the sheer amount of, human frailty.
Listen, Jordan, you're bang on. I think this is always what makes me lose some sleep, is the fact that this has to continue to be a whole of society situation, a whole of society effort. It is not something we can do on our own. And it is sometimes may feel insurmountable, but this is the work we're here to deliver. This is why we work with partners such as Media Smart. That's why we partnered with a company called Canadian Shield, where you can download this on your phone to add another additional layer to protect your phone from cyber attacks. This is why we partner with critical infrastructure in private sectors so that they can also be a mouthpiece on our behalf. This is why we've put out, many campaigns on misinformation and disinformation, because there's a recognition that we need to continue to educate our society. And education is really something that I feel continues to be quite important to do. And we can't do enough of it. And this is why these partners that we engage with, who are able to go to other parts of the society that we sometimes can't get to or that we can't do alone, and they help us in that outreach, is really important. So having even this podcast is important. The amount of listeners this is going to reach will hopefully raise that awareness about the fact that cybersecurity and cyber hygiene is something that matters to everyone, including an individual. So listen, we make no mistake. We don't fool ourselves that we're going to catch everything. We don't commit to a zero risk game, but we do recognize that if we don't keep talking about it, if we don't keep having these conversations, we're not helping in the education and the awareness. But this is why we are also promoting, and I think this was something I also was happy to hear Jesse Hirsch talk about, because this is well in line with what we've been promoting, is this security by design or the privacy by design. Mm-hmm. Like, this is very much what we want to see happen when people are developing their applications, is really building that in so that it's less dependent eventually on the human always being as vigilant. But let me be clear, vigilance will still always matter. And the layers of security is something we always want to be paying attention to, especially if you're a business, a small business in particular, because we know that sometimes they're the ones that are vulnerable, especially when it comes to the broader supply chain.
Well, here's my last question then, because obviously you guys are operating at the very top of the game with your intelligence partners when it comes to this, and you're seeing the emerging threats and responding to them. Most institutions and even law enforcement services are not at that level yet, I don't think. Like, how well have ordinary police or ordinary institutions, like, again, to use the Toronto Library as an example, caught up to these kind of attacks? And are we still losing that race?
I don't want to assume we're losing the race, because ultimately, every time a cyber incident happens, we're all learning. The institution that suffered it is learning and is making themselves more resilient for the next time. Do I hope that people will take our advice and be more resilient from the get-go? I do. But the reality of it is, we know that there are some organizations that are already overwhelmed with their day-to-day activities, that sometimes cybersecurity isn't front of mind. Mm-hmm. But this is why we continue to work with our provincial and territorial and municipal partners, as well as our Indigenous communities out there, because we know where some of the vulnerabilities are. And we've heard it, in particular from our municipal colleagues, that this is a vulnerability for them. And this is why we'll continue working with them and looking at different ways in which we can look at a regional presence potentially to be there for them or support them in different ways, whether bigger companies can be more supportive of the supply chain. Like, there are different ways in which we can look at how we can improve the national resilience. And this is one of the things we talk about in our national cybersecurity strategy that's in the process of being finalized and being published at some point, because we have to update the version we put out in 2017. But all this to say is that it is a learning every time an institution is hit. But what I'm proud is that, at least from the Government of Canada systems and the federal level, we're able to prevent 6.6 billion malicious attacks per day because of some of the services we offer. And this is why this conversation we're having is so important, because if some of those institutions want to potentially talk to us about how they can raise that cyber resilience, we are there for them. That is what our website, cyber.gc.ca, promotes, is talking to different members of our society and trying to meet them where they're at, along with the partners that I mentioned earlier, so that we can continue to be better informed, better equipped, be able to raise that cyber resilience together. But it's a tough job. And you're right that we're not going to see the end of this in the immediate, but I can't give up hope that we're going to get better.
Carolyn, thank you so much for this. Before you go, you mentioned your website. If a listener who's just heard this wants to improve their cyber hygiene, where's the one-stop shop that they can go to learn how to do that?
So Get Cyber Safe is one of the ways. You can just type that in the Google link, or cyber.gc.ca.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Carolyn Xavier, Chief of the Communications Security Establishment of Canada. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can also shoot us your ideas for stories by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us and leaving a voicemail 416-935-5935. You can find The Big Story in any podcast player you like, and of course, on your smart speaker, just ask it politely to play The Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.